Let us step back in time to the 14th century, when Europe's greatest defence against sickness was not a hospital, but a suspicious-looking man in a long robe waving herbs around like a salad gone bad. Imagine, if you will, being struck down with the dreaded bubonic plague, black swellings the size of apples popping up under your arms, and instead of being rushed to the ER for antibiotics, you're handed a leech and a prayer. The truth is, medieval medicine had no idea what was happening. Doctors didn't understand germs or bacteria. In fact, the only thing they did understand was that people were dying very quickly, and they had to come up with an explanation fast. So they blamed it on the stars, on bad air, or sometimes even on the neighbour's cat. It was a time when your horoscope might be consulted for medical advice, and sneezing too hard could be seen as a sign of divine punishment. Without antibiotics, what did people do? They improvised. They believed illness was caused by an imbalance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. So if you had the plague, the doctor's brilliant solution was to balance you. How? By draining your blood until you fainted or making you vomit into a bucket. One can imagine medieval patients thinking, "Doctor, I came in with a fever and now I can't stand up." One common treatment was bloodletting with leeches. Picture it, a plague victim lying on a straw mattress, barely clinging to life, while the doctor cheerfully announces, "Don't worry, I'll just stick a few of these slimy creatures on your arm. That should sort out your buboes." Of course, the patient usually died anyway, but at least the leeches were well fed. Another favoured method was the use of potions made from herbs, spices, and whatever else the apothecary had lying around. Garlic, vinegar, crushed emeralds, and even ground-up toads were all considered potential cures. If it sounds disgusting, that's because it was. People drank mixtures so foul they probably killed more taste buds than bacteria. The sad part? None of it worked, but at least it kept apothecaries in business. Then there were the plague doctors, dressed in their now famous beaked masks. These long, bird-like noses were stuffed with herbs to filter the bad air. To the average medieval villager, they must have looked like giant crows delivering bad news. One can imagine the terror of seeing one of these ominous birdmen approaching your house. "Oh no, the giant pigeon has come for Grandma." Their job was to examine the sick, but without real knowledge, all they could really do was poke at buboes with sticks and hope not to catch the plague themselves. Religion, of course, played a central role. Since medicine was more of a guessing game, many people turned to the church. They believed the plague was God's punishment for sin, so whole towns would gather for processions, whipping themselves bloody in hopes of divine mercy. Ironically, these mass gatherings just spread the disease faster. Imagine trying to escape infection by standing shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of coughing neighbours. It was the medieval version of a super-spreader event. And then there were the cures that sound more like cruel pranks than medicine. Some doctors recommended sitting next to a blazing fire, which often cooked the patient before curing them. Others suggested rubbing onions or even human waste into the sores. The logic was simple. If it smells terrible, surely the plague will run away. Spoiler alert, the plague did not run away. One of the more comical remedies involved holding a live chicken against your swollen lymph nodes. The belief was that the chicken would draw out the poison. In reality, the only thing being drawn out was the chicken's patience. Imagine lying there, covered in boils, while your family frantically straps a clucking bird to your armpit. If laughter truly is the best medicine, then this might have been the one treatment that helped, if only for a moment. But let us not laugh too hard, because without antibiotics, the odds of survival were slim. Even the strongest bodies fell quickly. Entire families vanished within a week. Villages turned into ghost towns, and grave diggers couldn't keep up with demand. The lack of medicine meant the plague had free rein, sweeping across Europe like a scythe through wheat. By the time it was over, up to half the population had perished. It's hard for us, in the modern world, to imagine just how helpless people felt. Today, we can pop a pill and fight infections that would have killed a medieval king. Back then, toothache could be fatal, and surgery was basically carpentry done on a human body without anaesthetic. The idea of antibiotics, tiny pills that could stop the plague in its tracks, would have seemed like sorcery. Yet in the midst of this tragedy, we can find some grim humour. Medieval medicine reminds us of humanity's endless creativity, even when hopelessly wrong. If there's one lesson to take from this era, it's that sometimes the cure really is worse than the disease. And perhaps, if we ever complain about taking antibiotics today, we should remember the alternative: being strapped to a chicken while a plague doctor in a bird mask waves a bunch of lavender in your face. In the end, the Black Death wasn't just a medical disaster, it was a comedy of errors written in human blood. A world without antibiotics meant that doctors could only experiment wildly, and patients were the unfortunate test subjects. It is both tragic and darkly funny that so many believed that garlic, gemstones, or poultry could turn the tide. What actually saved humanity was not their treatments, but the simple fact that enough people survived long enough to repopulate the world. So, the next time you catch a cold and complain about having to swallow antibiotics, remember this: it could be worse. You could be living in the Middle Ages, where your doctor's best advice was, try this potion of vinegar and crushed emeralds. If that fails, I've got a fresh chicken in the back. We have seen how the absence of medical knowledge and antibiotics left people utterly helpless against the plague. But even if medieval doctors had miraculously stumbled upon a cure, the conditions people lived in would have sabotaged everything. For the truth is, the plague didn't just thrive because medicine failed. It thrived because Europe's cities were, in the politest possible terms, absolutely disgusting. Let us wander into a medieval city, shall we? Not with our noses, of course, because one whiff of that stench and you'd be out cold, but with our imagination. Picture narrow cobblestone streets, barely wide enough for 2 carts to pass, crammed with people, animals and things you'd rather not identify. Chickens clucked in doorways, pigs rooted around in the muck, and somewhere in the distance a cow mooed angrily because someone had tied it too close to the tavern. Now, combine this barnyard with thousands of humans, and you have the perfect recipe for an urban nightmare. Bathing was considered suspicious. Why wash when dirt protects you? And waste disposal systems were virtually non-existent. Instead of modern plumbing, people emptied chamber pots straight out the window. Imagine strolling through the market in your finest medieval shoes, only to be splashed with mystery liquid from above. Spoiler, it wasn't water. The streets themselves were like a festival for germs. Piles of garbage lined the alleys, mingling with animal dung, spoiled food, and sometimes even human remains when the graveyards overflowed. Rain turned it all into a thick stew that flowed merrily down the gutters. Children played in it, merchants set up stalls beside it, and rats thought they'd stumbled into paradise. For fleas carrying Yersinia pestis an end, it was like finding the Ritz-Carlton. Crowding made things worse. Cities like Florence, London and Paris were bustling hubs of trade and culture, but also petri dishes of humanity. Entire families lived in one-room houses, pressed so tightly together you could sneeze on 4 people at once without turning your head. Privacy was non-existent, ventilation was poor, and cleanliness was a luxury few could afford. Add 1 plague-infected rat to this sardine tin, and you had a guaranteed outbreak. Let's not forget the livestock. Animals weren't kept outside the city. They lived right alongside people. Your neighbour might have had goats in the basement, pigs in the yard, and chickens nesting in the rafters. That meant fleas and vermin could happily skip from animal to human without missing a beat. In many cases, plague spread faster in towns than in the countryside simply because the city offered a buffet of warm bodies packed shoulder to shoulder. Markets and fairs, meanwhile, acted like giant plague parties. People travelled from village to city with carts full of goods, rats scurrying underneath. Crowds pressed together, coughing and sneezing, while sharing food handled by hands that hadn't seen soap in weeks. It was a germ's dream come true. Medieval people thought they were gathering for commerce and fellowship, but really they were giving the plague an open invitation. Now imagine the smell. We often romanticize medieval Europe with its castles, knights and ladies in gowns, but if you were actually there, you'd likely pass out from the odour before admiring the architecture. The combination of rotting food, sewage, smoke, sweat and animals produced an atmosphere so thick it was said you could taste it. And no, it didn't taste like chicken. It's no wonder people believed in bad air as a cause of disease. When the air itself made your eyes water, you'd blame it for everything too. Housing conditions did not help. Most buildings were made of wood and crammed together, so fires were common, but at least they occasionally burned away the filth. In the poorest quarters, families slept on straw mattresses that doubled as flea motels. Bedding was rarely washed, if at all, and clothes might be worn for months without a rinse. Fleas and lice thrived, happily hopping from person to person, carrying their microscopic killers. The city water supply was equally treacherous. Wells were often contaminated by nearby cesspits, meaning people drank water flavoured with the runoff of their own waste. Brewing beer was sometimes safer than drinking water, which explains why even children consumed weak ale on a daily basis. It wasn't just a cultural quirk, it was self-preservation. But when plague came, no amount of liquid bread could save you. Public health systems, of course, were non-existent. The idea of sanitation as we know it didn't exist. There were no garbage collectors, no sewage plants, no pest control officers. If you had a rat problem, you either got a cat or lived with it. And when plague hit, most cities had no emergency measures beyond ringing church bells and hoping for divine mercy. Some towns attempted to wall themselves off, but the rats were better at tunnelling than the guards were at guarding. For comedy's sake, let's imagine what would happen if modern city dwellers were dropped into this world. Picture a New Yorker stepping into a 14th century alley, dodging chamber pot rain while clutching their coffee. Or a Parisian tourist discovering that the Eiffel Tower is centuries away from existing, but the smell of sewage is already fully developed. Most of us wouldn't last a day without demanding refunds from the local lord. Yet medieval people took it all in stride. They lived, worked and raised families in conditions that would send a modern germaphobe into cardiac arrest. They didn't have the luxury of antibiotics, but even if they had, their filthy surroundings would have undone much of the progress. The plague didn't need to work hard. It was handed a kingdom of filth and invited to feast. And so, while we often credit the Black Death's devastation to its sheer deadliness, we must also credit the cities themselves. They were the perfect stage, crowded, dirty, noisy, and full of opportunities for a bacterium to shine. Without antibiotics, people stood little chance. Without sanitation, they didn't even get to start the fight. Perhaps the greatest irony is that medieval cities were also centres of art, commerce and culture, the very places that shaped Europe's history. Yet all that brilliance was built atop piles of refuse and swarms of rats. In the end, the same streets that hosted parades and festivals became the highways of death. So next time you flush a toilet, put out the trash, or sip a glass of clean water, take a moment to appreciate the luxuries of modern living. Because once upon a time, in the heart of Europe's greatest cities, life meant dodging sewage, battling rats, and praying that the next sneeze wasn't the last. And honestly, given the choice between antibiotics and a live chicken strapped to your armpit, I think we all know which one we'd pick. We've trudged through the muck of medieval cities, where filth and crowds made the plague's job far too easy. But as if overflowing chamber pots and armies of rats weren't enough, there were two other deadly allies of the plague: the weak and hungry bodies of Europe's people and the very trade routes that tied the continent together. In short, human frailty and human connection teamed up to give the Black Death a first-class ticket across Europe. Imagine being a peasant in the 14th century. You've just survived the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, a cheery little event where crops failed, livestock died, and people resorted to eating whatever they could find, including bark, dogs, and, according to some accounts, each other. Even in better years, your diet was about as exciting as a bowl of beige wallpaper paste, mostly bread, porridge, and maybe a turnip if you were lucky. Meat? Only if you could steal it from your lord's table. Vegetables? Seasonal at best. Vitamins? Nobody had ever heard of them. So when the plague showed up, it didn't find a Europe of robust, gym-toned bodies. It found a population that was already weak, scrawny, and half-starved. Malnutrition meant that immune systems were about as reliable as a medieval cartwheel, likely to collapse just when you needed it most. Even a simple cough could knock you out, let alone a flea bite carrying the world's deadliest bacterium. Picture poor Hans the farmer, working all day in the fields on a diet of stale bread and thin gruel. He's already skinny enough to disappear if he turns sideways, and now the plague shows up to finish the job. If antibiotics are a modern shield, then Hans' shield was more like a holy bit of parchment. It's hardly a fair fight. Malnutrition was not just about empty stomachs, it was about generations of bodies weakened over time. Children grew up stunted, adults were chronically tired, and the elderly were one bad winter away from the grave. The plague didn't even need to try hard. It walked into Europe, looked around at the weakened population and said, "Well, this is going to be easy. Now let's add travel and trade into the mix." Because even if some villages might have survived on their own, humanity has never been good at staying put. Europe was buzzing with merchants, pilgrims and sailors, all eager to buy, sell and prey in new places. Enter the Silk Road, the bustling arteries of the Mediterranean, and the thousands of carts rattling across the countryside, each carrying goods and stowaway rats. Ships were especially guilty. Rats loved ships like tourists love free buffets. Fleas hitched rides in their fur, and by the time the vessel docked, half the crew might already be coughing. When the plague reached the Italian ports of Genoa and Venice, it was like a grim gift basket delivered straight to Europe's doorstep. From there it spread inland with the speed of gossip at a royal banquet. Markets became super-spreader events centuries before that phrase was coined. Merchants set up stalls packed with spices, cloth and produce, all while rats scurried underfoot. Pilgrims gathered shoulder to shoulder, offering prayers while unknowingly sharing fleas. Trade fairs, which were meant to celebrate prosperity, turned into festivals of infection. The only thing moving faster than the plague was the speed at which rumours spread about who to blame. And let's not forget the great highways of Europe. Carts rolled from town to town, loaded with grain, wool and disease. Inns and taverns along the way were perfect hubs for fleas, rats and travellers alike. Imagine a weary merchant collapsing on a straw mattress at the end of a long day, unaware that the mattress had already checked in a family of fleas. By morning, he's a walking plague delivery service headed to the next town. To add a touch of comedy, picture a medieval customs officer trying to stop the spread. Do you have anything to declare? Yes, just some silk, spices and a highly contagious bacterium that will kill half of Europe. Very good, carry on. Of course, medieval people didn't know what was happening. They couldn't see bacteria, so they blamed the stars, the air, or even foreigners bringing in cursed goods. Ironically, their suspicion wasn't entirely wrong. Foreign ships really were bringing in death, but not because of sorcery. It was because of rats doing what rats do best, multiplying and making themselves at home wherever humans travelled. Meanwhile, hunger weakened entire communities. Families often shared a single loaf of bread for days, washing it down with thin ale. The plague struck hardest at those who were already frail, and malnourished bodies provided no resistance. For many, survival depended not on strength, but on sheer luck. Whether a flea happened to bite you or the person standing next to you. Together, weak immunity and constant travel created the perfect storm. The plague didn't just arrive, it sprinted. Within a few short years, it spread from port cities to the furthest countryside, leaving devastation in its wake. Villages vanished. Towns lost half their population, and trade itself collapsed because there was no one left to carry it on. In a darkly comic twist, the very networks that had made Europe rich and connected became the arteries of its greatest disaster. And yet, amid the despair, life went on. Merchants still loaded their carts. Peasants still tilled the soil, and pilgrims still marched to holy sites, because what else could they do? They didn't understand the mechanics of disease, but they did understand that survival meant eating, working, and moving. Unfortunately, those same instincts kept the plague alive and thriving. In the end, Europe's vulnerability was twofold. Its people were too weak to fight, and its roads were too busy to hide. Malnutrition and trade routes together gave the Black Death everything it needed: victims who couldn't resist, and highways that carried it everywhere. So next time you complain about airplane food, or worry about catching a cold on the subway, remember the 14th century. Back then, travel meant rats in the cargo hold, fleas in your bedding, and a plague bacterium waiting to make your acquaintance. And as for diet, well, let's just say your worst fast food meal is still a gourmet feast compared to a medieval peasant's porridge. The comedy of it all is that humans, in trying to connect, doomed themselves. Weak, hungry, and endlessly on the move, they handed the plague exactly what it needed to succeed. And the plague, never one to refuse a free ride, took full advantage. We've seen how malnutrition left people too weak to resist, and how busy trade routes carried death from port to port. But even when towns tried to slam their gates shut and stop the flood, the plague laughed in their faces. Quarantines were clumsy, inconsistent, and often completely useless. And just when people thought they'd seen the worst of it, the plague revealed it had not one but several deadly forms. Let us picture the scene. A small medieval town hears rumours that the plague is coming. Bells toll, town criers shout warnings, and the local lord dramatically orders the gates closed. "No one shall enter," he declares, proud of his brilliant defence strategy. Meanwhile, a rat casually scurries under the wall, carrying a flea that could wipe out half the population. So much for quarantine. The idea of quarantine wasn't entirely absent in the Middle Ages. In fact, the word comes from 40 giorni, meaning 40 days, a period sailors were sometimes forced to wait before entering Venetian ports. On paper, it was smart. In practice, it was like locking your front door but leaving all the windows open. Fleas and rats were not exactly known for respecting civic ordinances. Many towns attempted half-hearted measures, travellers were turned away, ships were kept offshore, and sick people were sometimes isolated in plague houses. But enforcement was inconsistent. Imagine being the guard stationed at the town gate. Sorry, no entry, unless you bribe me with a loaf of bread or some wine. And of course, once food ran low inside the walls, someone inevitably opened the gates anyway. Plague containment was less about science and more about wishful thinking. Then there were the smaller villages that thought they could hide. Some sealed themselves off completely, refusing to trade or travel. A noble attempt, but isolation didn't always work. All it took was one infected visitor, one delivery of grain, or one sneaky flea to break the bubble. Quarantine in the medieval world was like playing hide-and-seek with a disease that could teleport. And even when towns thought they'd contained it, they faced another problem. The plague didn't come in just one handy package. Oh no, it came in 3 delightful varieties, like a cursed sampler platter. First, the classic bubonic plague. This was the one with the famous black buboes, swollen lymph nodes the size of apples popping up in your armpits and groin. Painful, grotesque, and deadly, but at least you had a few days before it killed you. Then came the pneumonic plague, the plague's dramatic cousin. Instead of hiding in your lymph nodes, this one went straight for your lungs. Symptoms included coughing, chest pain, and, oh yes, spraying bloody droplets into the air. Suddenly, you didn't need rats or fleas at all. Just one sneeze in a crowded church, and half the congregation was doomed. Quarantine against pneumonic plague? Forget it. By the time the priest finished his sermon, the infection had already made itself comfortable. And if those weren't terrifying enough, there was the septicemic plague, the speed-run version of death. This form infected your bloodstream directly, killing victims so quickly they sometimes died before even developing the telltale buboes. One moment you had a fever, the next you were dead, often within 24 hours. Try quarantining that. By the time anyone noticed, the patient was already 6 feet under. The variety made things infinitely worse. A town might think they dodged the bullet because they hadn't seen buboes, only to find that what they actually had was pneumonic plague sweeping invisibly through the population. The unpredictability meant panic, confusion, and a complete breakdown of order. Medieval quarantine wasn't just ineffective, it was fighting the wrong enemy half the time. Add to this the human factor. People didn't like being locked up any more then than they do today. Families sneaked out of plague houses, merchants smuggled goods through secret passages, and priests ignored bans on gatherings because, well, souls needed saving. All of this turned quarantine into more of a polite suggestion. For a bit of comic imagery, imagine a town elder explaining the rules: stay in your homes, do not travel, and avoid all contact with others. Meanwhile, outside his window, children are chasing rats with sticks, neighbours are arguing over bread, and a procession of flagellants is marching through the square, whipping themselves and spreading droplets everywhere. Truly, medieval social distancing was about as effective as a screen door on a submarine. It's worth remembering that quarantine also created unintended consequences. Some towns that tried to seal themselves off ended up starving because they had no food supply without trade. Others descended into paranoia, blaming outsiders or minority groups for bringing the disease, leading to violence and persecution. The plague didn't just kill, it tore communities apart from the inside. Meanwhile, the disease itself was laughing. Bubonic plague said, "I'll take the villages." Pneumonic replied, "I've got the churches." Septicemic chimed in, "Don't worry, I'll handle anyone in a hurry." Together they were unstoppable, a gruesome team effort that no amount of closed gates could resist. What makes this all darkly funny is the sheer optimism of medieval leaders. They rang bells, locked doors, and banned fairs, convinced they had outsmarted the invisible killer. Yet the plague breezed past their efforts, changing forms whenever it pleased. It was like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. In the end, quarantine failed not because people didn't try, but because they didn't understand. Without knowing about bacteria, fleas, and airborne droplets, they were always fighting the wrong battle. And with 3 different versions of the plague playing tag team, survival was less about policy and more about blind luck. So while today we might complain about lockdowns, masks, or cancelled travel, we should spare a thought for medieval Europe. Their quarantines were too little, too late, and their understanding of disease was like a badly written instruction manual missing half the pages. And yet they carried on, trading, praying, living and dying, because what else could they do? The plague's multiple faces ensured that no one could ever truly feel safe. You could dodge the rat-borne bubonic plague, only to be felled by a neighbour's cough. You could isolate in your home, only to wake up with septicemia that gave you no chance at all. Quarantine was a door with holes, and the plague had all the keys. Perhaps the greatest comedy of all is that medieval people thought their walls and watchtowers could stop the Black Death. But the real enemies were too small to see, too quick to catch, and too diverse to predict. And so, in the long struggle between human hope and microbial mischief, the plague won, at least until modern science finally gave us the tools to fight back. Spring would cure them. The relics themselves ranged from the bones of saints to items as dubious as a feather from the Archangel Gabriel's wing. Whether genuine or not, these objects provided comfort, if not immunity. Sadly, travelling in huge groups to touch the same bones also meant sharing the same fleas. Misinformation was rampant. Without any scientific framework, people invented explanations faster than they could bury the dead. Some believed the stars had aligned badly. Others thought poisonous fumes were seeping out of the earth, and still others blamed witches, heretics, or anyone who looked even slightly suspicious. A sneeze in the wrong place could spark a panic. Rumours spread like wildfire. Did you hear? The Jews poisoned the wells. This baseless accusation led to horrific pogroms, with entire communities wiped out by angry mobs. Fear made people irrational, and irrationality made them dangerous. The plague wasn't just killing with bacteria, it was killing with paranoia. Superstitions thrived. People carried charms, wore amulets, or hung herbs around their necks to ward off bad air. Some believed that sitting between two roaring fires could burn the sickness out. Others thought bathing was risky, since opening your pores invited in the disease. The result? A population that was both filthy and flammable. Priests and monks did what they could, but their efforts often amounted to little more than last rites and prayers. Many clergy fled their posts, while others bravely stayed and died alongside their flock. For ordinary people, the church offered hope, but also confusion. Was the plague a punishment, a test, a prelude to the end of the world? No one knew for sure, but plenty of self-proclaimed prophets were happy to give terrifying answers. Comedy, dark as it may be, can be found in the sheer creativity of these explanations. Imagine a medieval news reporter announcing breaking plague caused by planetary misalignment, bad smells, and probably your neighbour's goose. With no Twitter to fact-check, the rumours stood unchallenged, and fear spread as fast as the disease itself. Social practices only fueled the fire. Funerals became mass events, with mourners crowding around the deceased, unaware they were giving the plague another opportunity to mingle. Markets remained open in many places because, well, people still needed bread, even if it came with a side of death. Weddings, too, carried on in some regions, leading to what we might call today plague-themed receptions. Fear and misinformation also fractured communities. Neighbours turned on one another, suspecting witchcraft or secret curses. Foreigners, beggars and minorities bore the brunt of the blame. often with tragic consequences. What the plague didn't destroy directly, human suspicion happily finished off. Of course, not all practices were destructive. Some attempts at prevention had a kernel of sense. Burning incense may not have cured disease, but at least it masked the smell of rotting bodies. Carrying flowers, the origin of ring around the rosy, provided a psychological shield, if not a medical one. Even the wildest rituals offered comfort in a world where everything else seemed to be collapsing. What's striking is how universal the response was. Whether through prayer, superstition, or rumour, people clung to anything that gave them a sense of control. The plague was invisible, mysterious, and unstoppable, so faith, fear, and misinformation became the tools of survival, even if they did more harm than good. To find the comedy, picture a medieval villager juggling all the advice he's been given. Don't bathe, stay indoors, go on pilgrimage, avoid Jews, carry herbs, whip yourself in the street, and whatever you do, don't sneeze. With so many contradictory instructions, survival must have felt like winning a lottery. And yet, in their confusion, medieval people weren't so different from us. Faced with a pandemic, they spread rumours, hoarded supplies, blamed outsiders, and gathered in large groups despite warnings. Sound familiar? The difference is that today we have science, antibiotics, and the internet, though the misinformation part sadly remains timeless. In the end, religion and fear were double-edged swords. They gave people comfort and community, but also sowed division and despair. Misinformation kept hope alive, but also misled countless people to their doom. The plague thrived on this chaos, feeding not only on bodies, but on the breakdown of trust. So while the Black Death was carried by fleas and rats, it was also carried by prayers, rumours, and a population desperate for answers. And perhaps the greatest joke of all is that, in trying to explain the inexplicable, humans only made themselves easier prey. At least we can admire their creativity. After all, how many civilizations can say they tried to cure a pandemic with whips, holy water, and the occasional magic goose feather? It may not have saved them, but it does make history a lot more entertaining.